Well, hello and welcome to my channel, The Withered Fig Tree. My name is Randy Silva and I've been doing Christian live streams on various Christian topics. And this one is part 6, and the title of the series is The Christian Assembly. Let's go ahead and get started. The title of part 6 is Were Early House Church Gatherings Just a Phase? As a small review, we saw last week that with Constantine's conversion to Christianity and the legalization of Christianity, wealth and power appeared for the first time in Christianity's history. And we also saw that basically overnight, Christian assemblies changed from small house gatherings to large assemblies in dedicated use ornate buildings. Now, it's understandable that the Christians empire-wide would celebrate and enjoy their newfound freedom from tyranny and be able to gather publicly for the first time in public spaces and public buildings. But what we don't know is how the small changes that we've been talking about in the first parts of this series, how those small changes in those house gatherings over the prior 2 centuries, how those changes affected this transition from house churches to ornate buildings. Basically, what I'm saying is it's impossible to know how this transition would have occurred if the real presence had not been developed. What would the 4th century post-Constantine church look like if the real presence, along with all of its religious accompaniments, things like altars, priests, clerical hierarchies, and the communal suppers, replaced with the Eucharist only? What would that transition have been like to large buildings if those things hadn't occurred earlier? Perhaps these things like altars and sacrifice of the Eucharist, maybe they would have just come into being along with the new buildings, but I don't think they would have. I think that they were all steps along the way that were essential parts of the evolution of the early church. Now, one thing I wanted to talk about, as I did in the last part, about how sometimes when I'm discussing these ante-Nicene fathers' writings and the history, it's easy to make the assumption that all Christendom agreed with this. In this case, the question is, did all Christendom agree and accept the new Constantinian form of worship in ornate temples with priests and an altar and the real presence in the Eucharist? Did all Christendom accept this? Because it seems like they did. If you look at history, as we read several parts of the writings of Eusebius, it really does seem that all in unison throughout the kingdom, throughout the empire, the Roman Empire that is, everybody just was on board. If that wasn't the case, if it was the case that there were regions that did not accept this, then what you would see is that those who did believe in Constantine's new form of imperial-backed Christianity, they wouldn't have just said, hey, you guys don't like wealth and power and ornate buildings? Well, too bad. That's the way it's going to be. Because that just... it's pretty obvious that the reason why they're going in that direction is because of wealth and power. Instead, what they would want to do is frame their opposition in terms of doctrinal disputes and heresy to justify their actions. The Nicene Creed and the canons of the Council of Nicaea, that was held in 325 AD, and that's when the creed and the canons came out. The primary conflict, as we talked about last week in part 5, had to do with this guy Arius. Now, Arius taught that Jesus was created by God and not co-eternal with the Father. The council would communicate their decisions with what are called canons. Perhaps you've heard of the Bible being a canon, or books within the Bible being a canon. And what does that have to do with firing cannonballs? Well, long before the word cannon was ever applied to weapons of war that shot cannonballs, it was used from the Greek word canon, which meant any straight rod or bar, rule, or standard of excellence. Now, relative to Jewish and Christian writings, canon means a recognized document or original and authoritative document. So the Council of Nicaea then would come out with a creed and with canons. The creed was what directly rejected Arianism. You don't really find it directly in the canons. With several statements of Christ being immortal and not created. In fact, let me just look at some of this. So this isn't the whole creed, but just one section of it says, "And in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, begotten from the Father before all ages, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, of the same essence as the Father, through him all things were made." As I was reading that, I started to remember back to my Catholic days. I was born and raised a Catholic from up until around the age of 12. And they don't use the Nicene Creed directly as a profession of faith, but the profession of faith that's currently used by Catholics has that in there, and it sounds an awful lot like that. So the Nicene Creed lives on. Okay, so that's the creed, and that's what dealt with Arianism. Now, the canons did have things that indirectly dealt with Arianism and also future disputes, might they occur. There were 20 canons released by the Council of Nicaea, and you can find them on the internet. Pretty easy to find and read all the canons. And they're really just like a short paragraph for each one. But canons 1, 5, 6, and 19 relate to the handling of heretics and those who had been excommunicated from the church for denying Christ's divinity. So you can see how that could be employed against those Arianists who would not accept the outcome of the Council of Nicaea. They would be called heretics, they would be labeled heretics, they would be excommunicated, and if they ever wanted to get back in the church, they would have to go through the processes that were described and defined by the canons. I also found, as I was reading the canons 1 through 4 of the council show the offices that had evolved in the church. There was, at the high end, at the top, the bishop, which at that point was called an episcopate, and an elder, which at that time was called a presbyter, and that's the word I'll use in this series. And then you had deacons. Now, in the New Testament, when you read about elders and overseers, the word bishop and presbyter are used interchangeably. These canons designate that there actually is a difference, that bishops are above presbyters. And it says the canons 1 through 4 say that both bishops and presbyters cannot be new converts. That's probably taken from 1 Timothy 3. And this is not in the Bible. It says they must be abstinent. And that is because they were the ones who were responsible for consecrating the Eucharist into the real presence, the real flesh and blood of Christ in the bread and wine. So because they were doing that priestly act, they felt like those people needed to be abstinent. I also found some interesting things in this canons 1 through 4. It goes so far as to say that their abstinence cannot be the result of self-castration. And if they had self-castrated, then they had to be removed. They had to be deposed, is what it says. If they had been castrated, against their will by some king or some other thing, then they could stay. But from then on, you couldn't castrate yourself. And that's because that practice had been done. Because if you do it that way, then you can be abstinent very easily. It also said things like they can't live with any women in their house besides close relatives like their mother and their aunt and their sister. So you really see those positions being solidified. Now, I'm not saying that the bishops over presbyters occurred in those canons, but that's the first time that it was ecumenically church-wide said, here's how it goes. And that had evolved over time in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Now, Canon 6 is also interesting and important because it says that the bishops of Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria enjoy a higher jurisdiction than all the other bishops in their regions. It also called out the Bishop of Jerusalem as special, but not in any sort of jurisdictional authoritative way, just that whoever happened to be the Bishop of Jerusalem was highly esteemed. So in the regions of Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria, those bishops were like the top bishops. And of course they were there in this group making these canons, and so I'm sure they were all for that. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about these Donatists. So the Donatists lived in the region of northwestern Africa in the area of Morocco, which is now the modern-day Morocco. And they really are the best example of a group that I could find that objected to Constantine's version of church in ornate buildings. Now, they were officially condemned by the Council of Arles in 314 AD and the Council of Carthage in 411 AD. But the question is why? Was it purely heretical reasons, as we would imagine, that they didn't follow the Bible or something like that? The doctrinal dispute that the church used to go after the Donatists, yeah, it's a hard word to say, Donatists. So the doctrinal dispute they used was the validity of sacraments administered by clergy. And they also disagreed with their abuse of, or their lack of recognition of church unity and authority. But the main sacrament was, they didn't think that the clergy, people like the bishops and presbyters, could administer the Eucharist if they were sinful. And I'm sure they probably did believe that, but that's not the reason why they were treated so harshly and dealt with so harshly. So those two councils I was just referring to, they dealt with this idea that could individual regions break away from the wider church? Or did bishops and councils have universal authority? And the answer is that the regions could not break away from the church, and that the bishops and councils, especially those in those three regions I talked about, have all the authority. But I think that their main opposition, what the Donatists didn't like, was they rejected the lavish churches and the temple-like worship that had emerged under Constantine and the ecumenical church. And it wasn't just that their opposition was about like the architecture itself or the size of the rooms itself, or the idea of having a dedicated building, because they did have in the area of Carthage some dedicated buildings at that time. But it was tied to their broader rejection of imperial Christianity and the idea that wealth and politics had infiltrated the church. Now, one of the reasons why we don't know much about them was because their own writings were all burned. So we'll never know what those things said. And It kind of goes as the saying goes, history is written by the victors. So the church, the bishops in Rome and Alexandria and Antioch had, I guess you'd say, adopted the political nature of Constantine, and that's how they were ruling. So they basically ruled through censorship. They got rid of all of the Donatists' writings. And so the only way we know about them is through their own writings, the writings of these two councils. Kind of their final date was, although they did exist beyond this, but on February 27th, 380 AD, Theodosius the First issued the Edict of Thessalonica, which declared Nicene Christianity as the official state religion of the Roman Empire. So Nicene Christianity being the type of Christianity defined by the Nicene Creed and by the canons of the Council of Nicaea. And that also then labeled other Christian sects and doctrines as heretical. And with that, he outlawed Donatism, and he used force to suppress them. Okay, so that is basically just an example that it wasn't church-wide, that the whole church adopted or went straight from house churches to these things with temple-like worship. There were some that objected, but because of the power and political power and wealth of Constantine and the Roman Empire, they were able to make the Nicene way the way of the whole church. Now, I wanted to talk about the organic reasons for house churches. So where I'm going with this is I want to talk about how house churches, well, we know why they went away, or why, that's a good way of saying it. We know why they went away, and there were a lot of good, bad reasons for why they went away. So is there a reason to still not have them? Now, if you look at the definition of organic, so we're talking about the organic reasons for house churches. Organic, in this sense, is describing a system or process that develops naturally from within without external coercion, central planning, or artificial enforcement. It evolves through voluntary interactions, cultural traditions, decentralized decision-making, and intrinsic order rather than imposed rules, fiat authority, or forced compliance. So from after Jesus was crucified all the way until the Council of Nicaea, or even before that really, when Constantine became a Christian in 313 AD, in that period of time, the church, although it was persecuted, that persecution was just, they didn't want any Christians at all. They weren't trying to influence their doctrine. So the church was able to evolve organically. So it started and evolved organically up until 313 AD. Now, if the church assembled in the homes of Christians for purely organic reasons, then there would be no reason to return to them. In other words, you could take the lessons learned from the mistakes that the early church had made in the second, third, and fourth centuries, and that you could remedy those with Christians, and they could continue then to meet in buildings like they currently. So what are these organic reasons? The first reason is lack of dedicated buildings. So Christianity began within the Jewish and Greco-Roman society without any formal infrastructure. Now, there were buildings like synagogues, but those were for Jewish spaces. You do see in the book of Acts that they continued to meet in the temple courts, but that was because they were, at that point, still Jewish members of society in good standing. Now, there were also pagan temples, but of course they couldn't go to those. You couldn't have like a pagan worship to the god of Saturn, on Saturday, and then The church would pay a little bit of money to rent it out on Sunday morning for church because there were all these idolatrous, pagan, demonic forces there. So you couldn't go there. So that really ruled out all the public places. The most natural, organic gathering place was private homes, just as extended families or philosophical groups would gather at that time. Okay, so then there's also the idea of the size and intimacy of the groups, and the house setting naturally facilitated closer relationships, and the shared meal, or the Lord's Supper, and also personal discipleship. What you see is that in the house church, you have people like sitting in a circle, you can imagine, and they are all talking and facing each other, versus a church which has pews or rows of chairs and a preacher or priest at the front. So everybody's facing, they're not talking to each other, they're all talking to this guy who's up front. So in a small group setting, you had this intimacy where you could talk to each other, you could have this meal, and you could have personal discipleship. An example of that is Romans 16, 3-5, and that's where Paul greets Priscilla and Aquila, who host a church in their house. Again, there's no Bible verse that says thou must meet in houses. There's a lot of freedom to how Christians can operate and assemble and praise their God. But we're looking at organic reasons now for why they at least started in these house churches. So another organic reason had to do with legal and safety concerns. Now, public assemblies would attract the authorities, and that would make house gatherings a safer option. Religious gatherings outside state-approved temples were often seen as rebellious. So you wouldn't want to be seen as rebellious. That would definitely attract the attention of the Roman police. Now, house churches were able to avoid the suspicion of forming religious assemblies by meeting in houses. And there's a good example of that in ante-Nicene writing. It was called the secret meetings, and it was an accusation against Christians in Pliny the Younger's letter to Trajan. That's in 112 AD. So apparently one of the groups of Pliny the Younger, they weren't able to lay low enough, and they were caught by the Romans. And they were accused of having a secret meeting. Now, another reason, organic reason, is Christianity as a family-oriented faith. The New Testament describes the church as a household of faith. In Galatians 6:10, for instance, it says, "Therefore as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers." So it describes these house churches, or the churches that would meet, as a family, and because they would meet in houses just like families meet in houses. The household structure fit organically with Christian-like relationships. Another example you can find in 1 Timothy 3:15, it says, this is a partial reading of that verse, "You will know how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of truth." So Paul is giving the direction that if you want to know how to conduct yourself, then just conduct yourself as you would in your family, when you're around the family of Christ. Now, there are also financial and economic factors. So since they didn't have to build any temples and they didn't have to rent any temples, then they could redirect their resources towards charity. Now, you can see an example of that is Paul's collections for the poor in Jerusalem in 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9. It also says that wealthy Christians opened up their homes to host Christian assemblies. And an example of that is Acts 16, verses 14-15. And this is where Lydia in Philippi was a wealthy woman who hosted a house church and invited Paul and his disciples into her house. Now, this is an important one. Eucharist as a communal meal. And it's the last organic reason I have. I'm sure there's others, but these are the ones that came to mind. Now, the Lord's Supper for sure was originally a full meal. And that would make homes a natural place to hold it. An example of this is Acts 2, verses 46 through 47. It says, "They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people." Now, as we have seen in the earlier episodes, the earlier parts, once the real presence doctrine entered the Eucharist, then there was no reason for a full meal. And so instead of having a full meal, it just came down to a loaf of bread and a cup of wine. And they still did that in houses. But then you could see how when you're in a building or in a temple like worship, then it's very easy just to have little pieces of bread, stale bread, wafers, and a cup of wine or little cups of juice or something. But if the Lord's Supper was intended to be a meal, it doesn't mean you couldn't have large buildings and large assemblies, but you could see how that would get in the way of it. It's much more difficult. I mean, churches every once in a while have like potlucks and things like that, but imagine organizing that in a large church of 1,000 every week. So, in conclusion, nowhere in the Bible are we commanded to meet in house churches. I've given the organic reasons as to why the early Christians met in homes, and the earlier parts. From the earlier parts, we know the events that caused these house churches to change into temple-like worship in lavish buildings. So in the remaining 2 episodes of this series, I want to put together some good reasons, or examine some good reasons, for why Christians could meet in homes even in our modern times. And so I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, like and subscribe and share it with your friends, and have a great evening.